Have you ever imagined a situation where one man's courage can change the fate of thousands? What if that man were a cowboy, and the life he saved was a native's, right in the tense heart of the Old West? The story I'm about to tell you is just that. A risky choice, a life saved, and of course a breathtaking twist. We are in a time when the line between right and wrong seemed thinner than ever. In the Old West, violence, hatred, and the disputes between natives and outsiders were a part of daily life. But amidst all this brutality, sometimes moments arise where compassion and courage defy even the darkest expectations. That's exactly what happened on that hot morning in Cedar Creek, a town in the heart of the Wild West. John Hayes, a lone cowboy, never imagined that his life would be forever changed by a simple act of boldness. He who saw himself as a man of few words and many deeds found his life intertwined with the fate of Tawa, a Cheyenne native, in a scenario of pure tension. What seemed like just another day in the desert turned into something that would change everything. And you may be wondering, how could such a simple rescue have such a huge impact in a place where violence and distrust ruled? Well, stay with me until the end, because what happened afterward might surprise you. John, in a risky decision, put himself in danger to save Tawa from a cruel fate. Imagine the scene: a man about to be hanged, a crowd eager for blood, and a cowboy willing to defy all odds. The simple act of cutting the rope that bound Tawa to his fatal destiny wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And it's at this moment, when one man's life crosses with another's, that the course of history can change. John Hayes' action wasn't just an act of courage. It was the spark that ignited a larger conflict, something that neither he nor Tawa nor the town of Cedar Creek could have imagined. Because when John defied the town's order, he didn't know that 100 natives were about to arrive, bringing with them a new decision to be made. With every step John took towards rescuing Tawa, he moved further from what he knew to be safe and closer to an uncertain future. The cowboy, the native, the town, all were about to be forced to make decisions that would mark their lives forever. And the most impressive part, these decisions weren't driven only by force, but by empathy and understanding, feelings that were rare in an era marked by so much hostility. Now imagine being in John's shoes, risking your life for someone who had previously been seen as an enemy. What was going through his mind? And, more importantly, what would happen after this act of courage? What could happen when 100 natives, in search of justice, arrived in the town? I invite you to stay with me, because what you'll discover next will leave you speechless. Let's dive deeper into this story and see how a simple act of courage can transform not only one man's life, but the fate of an entire town. But before we go further, let me ask you, what would you do if you had to make a decision like this? Stay with me, because the best is yet to come. As the dust rose and the 100 natives approached the town, the tension grew with every passing minute. No one knew exactly what would happen next. Were the natives a force of vengeance, or were they there seeking something greater? What seemed right to some was a colossal mistake to others. And in the midst of all this, John Hayes and Tawa found themselves at the epicenter of a confrontation that could be fatal for both of them and for all of Cedar Creek. But before the story continues, I want to ask you something. Something simple, but that makes all the difference. If this story touched you even just a little, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think about John's courage and the decision he made. Have you ever been through something similar? Or do you have any thoughts on how one man's choices can affect so many lives? Let's talk about it, because exchanging ideas is what makes everything even more enriching. And if you're feeling inspired or moved by the story so far, don't forget to like the video. Every like helps spread this content, bringing these emotional stories to more people who, just like you, believe in the power of good actions and the strength of the right choices at the right time. Your like is the motivation to keep bringing more stories like this. Now, if you truly believe in the value of this type of content and want to keep following these stories that move and teach, subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll be the first to know when new stories like this are shared. Your subscription is crucial support for us to continue bringing stories that connect and inspire. I sincerely thank you for your participation here. It is your interaction that helps this channel grow and reach more people with these messages. Every comment, like, and subscription helps keep this exchange of experiences, courage, and humanity alive. And now with your participation, we can continue this journey where one man's decision goes beyond his own life and reaches something much greater. Now back to the story. When John Hayes saw the dust cloud approaching, he knew that what happened next would change everything. The choices had already been made, but the consequences, those were yet to come. Cedar Creek wasn't exactly the kind of place where you'd expect to see kindness flourish. The town, with its dusty streets and wooden buildings, was rooted in conflicts that seemed to never end. The Old West, with its relentless nature, was a land where violence, distrust, and fear dominated relationships, especially between cowboys and natives. It was a time when the line between right and wrong was blurry, and decisions often depended on survival, not morality. John Hayes, the lone cowboy, had settled in Cedar Creek more by chance than by choice. Coming from distant lands, he was an outsider, someone who didn't fit in either with the natives or the settlers. It wasn't in his nature to get involved in disputes, but he also couldn't turn a blind eye to the injustices around him. John was known for his skill with a lasso, his courage in extreme situations, but also for his ability to see beyond the surface, something rare at that time. He knew that, although he was just another man trying to survive in a place where survival was everything, one man's actions could transform the fate of others. On the other hand, Tawa, the Cheyenne native, carried with him a very different story. Like many of his people, he had been forced to live under the constant pressure of the local authorities, who saw him as a threat, not as a human being. The war between natives and cowboys was a never-ending cycle of violence and retaliation, where each side fueled the other's hatred. Tawa, however, was not a man of hatred. He was a survivor, someone who, despite the adversities, kept in his heart the hope that something greater could arise from his journey. Perhaps that was the true reason he was in Cedar Creek on that fateful day. He knew the town wasn't just a prison for his body, but also for the soul of anyone who lived there. Tawa's fate, however, seemed already sealed. Condemned to death for the simple reason of being who he was, his execution was scheduled for that morning. The ropes for the hanging were prepared, and the crowd, thirsty for justice or vengeance, depending on the perspective, waited in silence. Cedar Creek was about to witness yet another dark chapter in its history, where Tawa's life would be taken in the name of order and peace. But, as in the stories that truly mark us, what no one expected was that one decision would change everything. John Hayes, watching from afar, knew that if he stayed silent, nothing would change. He had two options: continue as a spectator or act. And it wasn't just Tawa's life that was at stake. It was the fate of everyone there. John's action in that moment wasn't just about saving one man. It was about challenging the system, about saying there is always an alternative path, a choice for humanity, even when everything around says there's nothing left but violence. The courage John would need in that moment wouldn't come from a simple impulse. It was something much greater, something that, as he would soon discover, had the power to change not only Tawa's fate, but that of everyone in Cedar Creek. But what no one knew, not even John, was that rescuing Tawa would only be the beginning of a journey that would become a confrontation of forces far greater than he had imagined. With the cowboy deciding to act and Tawa's life being saved, the stage was set for change. But what would happen when 100 natives arrived in the town in search of justice? That was the real question. What seemed like a simple intervention would end up being a catalyst for something much deeper and more transformative. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject to understand how seemingly small choices can reverberate in unexpected ways. John's reaction in doing something so unthinkable at that moment begins to show the impact our decisions can have, not only on our own lives but also on the fate of everyone around us. And when we place ourselves in the position of others, as John did, something magical starts to happen, the transformation of a moment. And that was what followed, the true turning point of the story. The sun was high in Cedar Creek's sky, and the heat seemed to weigh even heavier on the town's shoulders, as if the very climate was judging that day. The streets, which were usually silent, were strangely bustling, a constant murmur echoing through the corners and alleys. The small town was on high alert. Today wouldn't be just any day. It was the day of Tawa's execution. He, a Cheyenne native, was there, on lands that were no longer his, condemned to death not for any crime he had committed, but for being who he was. In a world where intolerance reigned, where the color of one's skin and the origin of every person defined their worth. Tawa was a victim of a system that did not recognize his humanity. He knew this as well as any other native who had been humiliated, driven out, and, in many cases, killed simply for trying to survive. But what he didn't know was that, on this day, he would become the key player in a story that would transform not just his life, but the lives of many others. Tawa was tied up, his arms bound, his eyes calm, but with a deep spark, as if he knew that somehow he had a much greater role to play than being yet another victim of an unjust system. The rope was ready to be thrown over his neck, and the eyes of the town were all on him. Some looked with anger, wishing for this to be yet another lesson to be taught, while others, the few who still believed in goodness, felt a mix of sadness and helplessness. Tawa's hanging wasn't just the death of a man, but a symbol of what Cedar Creek represented, a microcosm of a brutal era, where the strong imposed themselves on the weak and where compassion was a rare commodity. The town was divided. Most wanted it to be over quickly. For them, justice was being served. But for a handful of people who saw Tawa with a different gaze, he was not just a man to be executed, but the victim of a story that seemed endless. The question was, what would happen if this story somehow took an unexpected turn? As the crowd prepared for the execution, silence took over Cedar Creek, broken only by the sound of a horse's hooves approaching. It was John Hayes, the lone cowboy, who until that moment had been just a spectator of the town's story. But he knew he couldn't stay on the sidelines. He wasn't a man to fight for just any cause, but there was something about Tawa that touched his soul in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if this situation was the decision of his life, a turning point that would determine who he was, not just as a cowboy, but as a human being. What motivated John to act was more than just the simple injustice of the moment. He was seeing the reflection of a deeper story, a cycle of violence and hatred that would never end unless someone dared to break it. Tawa wasn't just a condemned native. He was a reflection of an era that had not known how to live with difference. John knew this, but the question was, would John also understand the power of his choice? There in the middle of that dusty square, John's decision was clear. He could wait no longer. In a burst of courage, something he hadn't even anticipated, he galloped toward the center of the town. It wasn't an impulsive decision, but rather the result of a mindset that many would rather ignore. The mindset that sometimes a solitary action can change the course of destiny. To many, what he was about to do would be a mistake. To others, it would be salvation. But for John Hayes, it was a choice of humanity amidst chaos. Now I want to dive even deeper into this subject, because what John was about to do wasn't just about rescuing Tawa. It was about transforming a system, trying to break a cycle of suffering that had been repeating generation after generation. Each of us, at some point, faces choices that may not seem large, but have the power to change lives. And this moment for John was one of those. What he did from then on would define not just his destiny, but the destiny of many others. Because choices have this power. They reverberate. They create waves that spread far beyond what we can imagine. But while John made his decision, the town was about to witness something even more surprising. What seemed like a simple rescue could in fact be the spark for something much larger. Because at the same time that John was preparing to challenge Tawa's execution, another force was moving, a force he hadn't even begun to understand. The square was filled with tension. Tawa's hanging seemed like a final sentence, the condemnation of the system, the era, and everything the town represented at that moment. A man's life was about to be taken mercilessly, as if his existence had never held any value, as if his fate had been sealed the moment he was born. But in that grim scenario, something unexpected happened. A man appeared, not with the arrogance of a vigilante, but with the firmness of someone who knew what was right, even if the world around him said otherwise. It was John Hayes, the cowboy. John was not the typical hero of Old West stories. He didn't have the hardened gaze of a gunslinger from the movies, nor the arrogance of someone who believed that physical strength and skill with weapons were all that mattered. No, John Hayes was a simple man with an ordinary appearance, a worn hat, and boots scuffed by time. But behind his calm facade, there was something much deeper, a quiet courage and a sense of justice that drove him. even if it meant defying the rules that governed that unforgiving world. He didn't come there with the intention of being the hero, nor with the expectation of changing everyone's fate. But something inside him, something much stronger than fear or reason, made him act. John knew that Tower's life at that moment wasn't just about a native being executed. It was about the opportunity to break a cycle of violence, of inhumanity that had been perpetuated for generations. He felt deeply that this was one of those rare moments when an action could indeed change everything. And no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the truth was clear. He couldn't just turn his back and let Tower die. The cowboy approached the scene with unshakable determination, his horse trotting calmly over the parched earth. The crowd's gazes turned to him, some with disdain, others with curiosity. After all, he wasn't a traditional hero, someone everyone had expected. But he wasn't just anyone. John Hayes had something others didn't: the ability to act when everyone around him was paralyzed by fear or indifference. He wasn't impulsive, but he was driven by something stronger than reason itself. When he saw Tower, bound by his condemnation, anger and frustration took hold of him. It wasn't just the injustice of the situation that affected him, but the certainty that he, like any human being, had the responsibility to try to change the course of history when the opportunity arose. That morning, he wasn't just a cowboy with a revolver at his side. He was the man who would make the difference, the man who would dare to challenge the system and show everyone that courage and compassion could still win. John wasn't sure what would happen next. He knew that by trying to rescue Tower, he was putting his own life at risk. But what was the life of a man if it wasn't the reflection of his choices? The cowboy knew that, by making that decision, he was beginning a journey with no return, not just for him, but for Tower himself, and for everyone willing to follow a path of justice, even if it meant facing an enemy far greater than any gunslinger. The decision was made. And so, without hesitation, John approached the rope that held Tower, his heart pounding. He knew that what he was about to do wasn't just a solitary action, but an act of rebellion against everything the town represented at that moment. He wasn't just a cowboy. He was the embodiment of those few who still believed that, in the end, true strength wasn't in weapons or brutality, but in the ability to act according to what was right. Now, I want to dive even deeper into this subject, because John's choice wasn't just an isolated act. It was the reflection of a mindset that, in a world full of distrust and violence, still believed there was a nobler path to follow. He wasn't just challenging the authorities or the town's social norms. He was challenging the very concept that things couldn't change, that the cycle of hatred and violence was immutable. That morning, John Hayes wasn't just fighting for one man's life, but for the idea that, even in the most hopeless situations, compassion and courage could be the key to breaking the chains of the past. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was willing to pay the price if necessary. And this choice, this courage to risk it all for something greater than himself, is what transforms a simple cowboy into a true hero. The sun still burned the horizon. The square was filled with heavy, silent gazes, as if all the weight of the town was concentrated there in that crucial moment. The rope, already prepared, was about to tighten around Tower's neck, and the sound of the crowd grew quieter as the moment approached. The native's fate seemed sealed, with no alternatives, no hope left. The sentence was about to be executed, and the town of Cedar Creek, with its unyielding nature, awaited anxiously for the conclusion of a story that already seemed written. But at the moment when the tension seemed to overtake everyone present, something unimaginable happened. Amid the hot and thick air, the sound of hooves breaking the silence cut through the tension like a sharp blade. John Hayes, the cowboy who until that moment had been merely a spectator, took the unthinkable step. He was no longer there to watch, he was there to change the course of that story. With an instinctive surge, he pulled on, the reins of his horse, the cords of his own courage tightening his chest, and charged toward the center of the square. There was no more time to hesitate. The decision was made. In a swift, precise movement, John cut the rope that held Tower, defying all expectations, all laws, and putting his own life and safety at risk. The crowd, initially paralyzed, exploded in a mix of shouts and murmurs. Some were stunned, others outraged, but no one could ignore what had just happened. Tower's rescue was more than an act of courage, it was a declaration. a clear sign that in a world where right and wrong were often defined by power and force, there was still room for something deeper, something more human. But in doing so, John knew that it wasn't just Tawa's life at stake. It was his own too. He was challenging the local authorities, risking his own existence for a cause that, in that moment, might have seemed meaningless to many. He didn't know what would happen next. Perhaps he would be captured, perhaps he would be the target of vengeance. Maybe he was simply another man condemned for his impulsive actions, or maybe, just maybe, he would be the first to change the course of Cedar Creek's history. What surprised him most was the immediate reaction of the town. It wasn't just the look of disdain from some, nor the shouts of anger that echoed through the square. It was the fact that for a moment, no one knew what to do. The expectation of seeing Tawa hanged turned into an unsettling silence, a sense that in the blink of an eye everything had changed. John's courage had shattered the established order, the security of tradition, and now what remained was the uncertainty of what would come next. But for John, the real battle wasn't the fight against others. It was the internal battle he had fought, the one that had led him to take the unthinkable step. He knew the consequences could be severe. He knew that, by challenging Cedar Creek's system, he might become a target, perhaps even a legend, but a legend of the kind no one would want to become. But he also knew something deeper, that true courage doesn't come from the absence of fear, but from the ability to act even when fear is palpable. And it was this feeling, this power of decision, that made John not hesitate. He didn't know if he was saving Tawa's life or simply taking too great a risk. But in that moment, he was doing something that, deep down, he felt needed to be done. Cutting the rope wasn't just about saving a man. It was a way of standing up against something bigger, something that had to do with dignity, respect for others, compassion, even in times when it seemed to be in short supply. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because in doing the unthinkable, John wasn't just challenging the conventions of an entire town, but also challenging himself. He was doing the right thing, even when no one around him believed it was possible. That's the power of decisions. They aren't just about what happens immediately, but about how they reverberate through time. What John did there was more than a simple rescue. It was an intervention in the flow of history itself, a challenge to the idea that things must always follow the same course. John's reaction to cutting Tawa's rope is, in many ways, a reflection of all the times true courage rises against adversity and expectations. He was, in a way, changing the narrative, not just of the town, but of his own life. And it's at that moment, in the act of challenging the system, that the real transformation begins. Change doesn't happen when everything seems under control. It happens when, in the blink of an eye, someone decides to act against what everyone else considers normal or safe. Cutting the rope was the breaking point, a moment that, in the blink of an eye, transformed the entire dynamic of the town. Cedar Creek, which had once breathed its daily routine of tension and violence, was suddenly enveloped in a strange and heavy silence, as if time had stopped, twisting and trying to understand what had just happened. The square, which had been filled with people ready to witness Tawa's execution, now seemed like an emotional battlefield, where each person was divided, not between natives and cowboys, but between morality and obedience, courage and fear. John Hayes and Tawa, with the reins pulled tight and adrenaline coursing through them, fled quickly, riding without looking back. The sound of the horses' hooves pounding on the dirt ground seemed to slice through the tense air of the town. But as they moved away, the town was still there, immersed in a silent conflict. What had just happened wasn't just a simple rescue. It was an act that defied everything the town believed was right. What seemed like an act of heroism to some was an affront to the established order to others. And now, the consequences were about to unfold. The silence was broken by an explosion of murmurs, discussions, and finally shouts. Some began to clap. Others just stared in shock, unable to understand what was happening. There was a small portion of Cedar Creek's population, those who could still see beyond the brutality, who felt a wave of admiration for John. They saw in his act the courage that many had lost, a rare courage that emerged in moments when true justice superseded the imposed rules. It was as if a spark of hope, which until then seemed to have gone out, had reignited, bringing a flame of humanity that many believed no longer existed. On the other hand, there were those who were furious. They saw John not as a hero, but as a traitor. How dare someone challenge the town's authority? How dare someone interfere with the order of things? For them, John's action was an insult to everything they believed to be right. The laws of Cedar Creek, which seemed immutable, had been broken in an instant, and this kind of challenge for them could not go unanswered. Vengeance, as always, seemed like the most logical path, and so the town divided. On one side were those who saw John as a symbol of courage and change. On the other were those who sought revenge, those who saw the Cowboys' life as a price to be paid for daring to interfere in Tawa's fate. Cedar Creek was now at the heart of a silent moral battle, where what was at stake wasn't just the lives of two men, but the future of the entire town. Tensions escalated. Doubt hung in the air. What would the price of courage be? And more importantly, what would happen next? The town was no longer the same. There was a before and an after that act. The streets of Cedar Creek, which once were merely passageways, were now marked by a choice that resonated at every corner, in every glance, in every word whispered between the people. The division John had caused wasn't just between cowboys and natives, but between those who wanted to maintain the old order and those who were beginning to believe that change was possible. Yet no one knew how far this division would go, or how the lines of conflict would become clearer as time went on. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this division is not just about what happened in Cedar Creek. It's about how in moments of crisis, individual decisions can divide not just a town, but an entire community. What John did there wasn't just a rescue, it was a seed of transformation. But like all change, it brings resistance. And resistance is often fierce. How would the town react over time? Would one man's courage be enough to challenge the mentality of an entire society? As John and Tawa rode away from the town, Cedar Creek was no longer the same. It was on the verge of a silent revolution. And in the meantime, the journey of John Hayes and Tawa was just beginning. The impact of their choices would resonate far longer than they could ever imagine. As the dust still rose from the hoofprints of John Hayes and Tawa, galloping away down the dusty road, the town of Cedar Creek began to digest the consequences of what had just happened. For many, it seemed that the greatest danger had passed. Tawa's execution had been interrupted. The cowboy had done the unthinkable, and now, with both of them gone, there was a sense of relief in the air. But that sense of security was fleeting, like a brief flash before a storm. And what no one knew, what no one expected, was that the true test was just beginning. From the distant horizon, where the land blended with the sky, a dust cloud began to form. At first it seemed like just another of those gusts of wind that the desert always brings. But as the cloud drew closer, something began to change in the air. It was a palpable feeling, a premonition that something big was coming. The people of Cedar Creek, still processing the impact of Tawa's rescue, began to feel the weight of this arrival. They didn't know what it was, but everyone's instinct was the same. Whatever it was, it wouldn't bring good news. And then, the truth revealed itself. At the top of the hill, a line of figures emerged from the dust, riding in formation, like a wave about to crash. 100 natives, a massive force, arriving in the town with a clear purpose. They were not just a war party, as many might think. They were not there to destroy, to pillage, or to avenge what had happened to Tawa. No, these 100 natives were there because Tawa played a central role in the fate of all of Hatham. He was not just a man lost in a town. He was a symbol, a link between two worlds, and his life held a value that transcended any territorial dispute or conflict. He was the key to something greater, something even Cedar Creek could not ignore. The arrival of these 100 natives was a shock to everyone. The town, which had until then been divided between those who admired John's courage and those who thirsted for revenge, now faced a new threat, but more than a threat, a revelation. Those men and women with dark skin and clothes made to withstand the desert heat were not common enemies. They were there with a much deeper mission, to bring a change that could alter the course of Cedar Creek's history, perhaps the history of the entire Old West. And Tawa, the man John Hayes had rescued, was not just a victim of a cruel system, he was the key to this change. The crowd, which had been spreading throughout the town, was immediately overtaken by a new fear. The sound of hooves, pounding the earth strong and resonant, announced the arrival of the natives with an unexpected force. Some tried to hide, others ran to arm themselves, and even the bravest began to wonder what the arrival of so many natives could mean for the town. The tension, already palpable because of Tawa's rescue, now turned into an irreversible fear. What did they want? Were they there for revenge, as many imagined? Or in some way, were they there to do something no one in Cedar Creek had ever considered? Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the arrival of the 100 natives wasn't just a surprise. It was the mark of a moment of transformation. They weren't just imposing a confrontation, but bringing a revelation that would change the mentality and power structure of Cedar Creek. Behind that group was a much more complex and powerful message. They weren't there to destroy, but to restore something that had been lost, something that Tawa represented. And so, the town, which was already divided between those who supported John and those seeking revenge, now found itself at a crossroads of even more difficult choices. What would the natives do? What did Tawa represent to them? And more importantly, what would everyone in the town need to learn and understand in this crucial moment of their lives? The impact of this arrival wouldn't be something that could be contained in just a few hours. Cedar Creek was about to be tested in ways no one had imagined, and the revelations that followed would be deeper than anyone could anticipate. The arrival of the 100 natives wasn't just a show of force, but a turning point. The town of Cedar Creek, which had until then been divided by internal issues and individual conflicts, now faced something much bigger, a decision that had the power to change everything. The tension, which had been building since Tawa's rescue, reached unimaginable levels. The air was thick, and every breath seemed marked by the expectation of something imminent. John Hayes, with Tawa still by his side, knew the situation was far from resolved. At that moment, he wasn't just a man running away with a native. He was the epicenter of a storm, the man who had dared to challenge the norms of an entire town, and who now faced the weight of the consequences. The town was in danger, not only from the arrival of the natives, but from the growing tension that divided everyone within it. With every passing minute, the idea of a war between the two groups seemed more plausible. The 100 natives weren't just there to avenge an act. They were there with a mission, with a greater purpose. And in many ways, Tawa was the key to that. He wasn't just a rescued man. He was the link between these two worlds. What motivated the natives to come to Cedar Creek? It was a question everyone asked. Some believed their arrival was merely a warning, a show of strength, a veiled threat to the town that had allowed Tawa's execution. Others, however, suspected that there was something deeper at play. Tawa's gaze, the man who until then seemed like just another victim of the system, had become something more. He carried within him the weight of an understanding that even he didn't fully comprehend. The natives were there because in some way he represented a change, a turning point. He wasn't just a symbol of resistance, but the very reflection of a new path that could be followed, a path that, in some sense, required the transformation of both sides, the understanding of what justice meant in a world marked by violence. Now, as the 100 natives drew closer, Cedar Creek found itself on the brink of an abyss. The tension between the two groups was palpable, as if the air was charged with electricity, ready to release a storm. What had seemed like a simple rescue had turned into a global dispute, a battle for the soul of Cedar Creek. And the most distressing part of all, no one knew what would happen next. The natives, with their firm postures and penetrating eyes, looked at the cowboys of the town, and the feeling between the two groups was one of an impending confrontation. But what no one knew was that the confrontation wasn't just about power or revenge. It was about something much greater, a true journey of transformation. It was about breaking the barriers of hatred, intolerance, and the idea that one people should dominate the other. It was about the hidden truth, about recognizing that both sides, though seemingly so different, were more connected than they had ever imagined. John Hayes, with the courage that had led him to that moment, felt the weight of that responsibility. He knew that the choice he would make, the decision he would take there, could be the last one he ever made. The town, for its part, didn't know whether to yield to the pressure of the natives or to stand firm in its defense. But as the two groups faced each other, one thing became increasingly clear. This moment wasn't just a physical battle. It was a battle of ideas, of visions about what it meant to live in a more just world. Tawa, the man who had been written off as lost, was now at the center of the story. He was the key to the transformation, but also the breaking point. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject because often in moments of great tension, the greatest challenge isn't the physical confrontation, but the battle we fight within ourselves. John Hayes and the natives were facing off. Yes, but it wasn't just a matter of who would come out victorious. It was a matter of which values would prevail. How can one man's courage influence the history of an entire town? And more importantly, would both sides be able to see beyond the violence and build something new, something stronger than the hatred that divided them? The tension on the streets of Cedar Creek was at its peak. The 100 natives, now positioned before the Cowboys, stood still, awaiting the town's reaction. The air seemed electrified, and while words were spoken with the weight of veiled threats, no one truly knew what would happen next. A confrontation was about to occur, and both sides were preparing for a battle that, if it turned physical, could be catastrophic for both. But then, when darkness seemed poised to swallow the entire situation, something incredible happened. Wire, the leader of the natives, the man who carried not only the weight of his tribe, but also the wisdom accumulated from years of struggle and negotiation, stepped forward. He was a man respected, not only for his strength, but for his ability to see beyond war, to think about the consequences of his actions. He knew that the situation in Cedar Creek couldn't be solved with more bloodshed. The last thing he wanted was to see more lives lost in a town already marked by violence. Wire looked at John Hayes, who stood firm, but with the tension visible in every line of his face. The cowboy knew the town was divided, but he also knew that the only way to truly save this moment, to avoid history repeating itself in a spiral of vengeance and suffering, would be to do the unthinkable. Not fight, not wage war, but seek a peaceful solution. And that's exactly what Wire did. With surprising calm, the native leader asked for a meeting with John Hayes. The words he spoke at that moment echoed like a ray of light in the darkness. "We don't need to spill more blood. Let's talk. Let's understand each other." That simple phrase, spoken by a man who seemed to carry the world on his shoulders, was what changed everything. The whole town, which was ready to witness a battle that would further divide the two cultures, fell silent. Everyone expected more anger, more confrontations, more revenge. But Wire was offering something much more difficult: understanding. John Hayes, who had always been a man of action, now found himself facing a crucial decision. He could, with the same force that had rescued Tawa, refuse that request for a conversation. He could have closed himself off in the mindset of a cowboy, acting on impulses. But in that moment, he understood that courage wasn't just about acting when a battle was imminent, but also having the courage to listen, to seek understanding. He knew that by accepting that conversation, he wasn't just saving his own life, but perhaps saving the town of Cedar Creek from destruction. As the two men made their way to a more secluded place, the whole town held its breath. No one knew what would happen. The Cowboys were ready to act, but they were also divided. Some wanted to charge into an immediate confrontation, while others, more cautious, waited to see what could be a true opportunity for change. On one side, the natives stood with determined looks, but also a glimmer of hope. The hope that this wouldn't be another battle, but the beginning of a new journey. The meeting between Wire and John Hayes was, without a doubt, the moment that turned the tide in that conflict. They weren't just there to discuss the recent events, but to discuss something much bigger: the possibility of coexistence, of overcoming the barriers of the past, and building something stronger than hatred, stronger than the memories of past battles. They weren't just seeking a solution for that moment. They were trying to rewrite the destiny of two peoples who had seen each other as enemies for generations. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what Wire and John did there wasn't simply an exchange of words. They were creating a bridge, a rare opportunity for transformation. That meeting was a decisive moment, where one man's actions were guided by compassion and humanity, not by force. Wire didn't just interrupt the cycle of violence, he laid the foundations for a silent revolution, a revolution that wouldn't begin with weapons, but with understanding. This decision, this ability to place reason and empathy above anger, is what transformed the dynamics of Cedar Creek. It was a powerful lesson, something that many, given the circumstances, wouldn't have been able to do. True strength, as John Hayes and Wire demonstrated, wasn't about domination, but about learning to listen, to understand, and to open oneself to the other, even when it seemed impossible. The story of John Hayes and Tawa is much more than a simple narrative of rescues and confrontations. It is a true lesson in how, in the darkest moments, when tension seems to consume all options, there is still room for courage, compassion, and above all, a decision capable of changing destinies. John's act of cutting the rope that would have hung Tawa was not just a physical intervention, it was the manifestation of something greater, the belief that even when everything around us seems lost, our actions can open doors to something new. And what John did that day didn't just save a life, it reignited a spark of hope in a place that was on the brink of collapse. When John made the decision to act, he didn't know how the town would react or what the consequences would be for him and Tawa, but he felt deeply that he couldn't stand still. He knew that by defying the order, he was changing the course of something much larger, not just one man's life, but the future of an entire community. In an era where tensions between cowboys and natives were constant, that risky decision brought forth the possibility of something many thought impossible: understanding, connection, and transformation. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about it all is the silent impact that this type of action can have on future generations. The town of Cedar Creek, which had been divided by old grudges and hatred fueled by history, now found itself at a crossroads. What did that moment represent for them? A chance to continue the cycle of violence, or an opportunity to build something new, more humane, and more just? And how can one man's courage, in a single gesture, plant the seed for profound change? The story of John Hayes and Tawa reminds us that our decisions, no matter how small they may seem, reverberate far beyond what we imagine, impacting not only our present, but also the future of those who will come after us. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because if there's anything we can learn from John and Tawa's journey, it's that true transformation doesn't happen in moments of comfort, but when we are challenged to act with courage. So even in the most difficult circumstances, when we face fear and choose the path of compassion, change happens not just within us, but around us. And this goes beyond any conflict. It goes beyond any kind of struggle. It's a choice that can change not just our lives, but the course of history. If you made it to the end of this video, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Stories like this have a transformative power, and I'm glad you joined me on this journey. If this content moved you in some way, let me know in the comments. This message was for me. That way I'll know we're connected, and that you, like me, believe in the power of choices and transformation. If you enjoyed what you saw, give that like button a tap, because it not only helps me keep bringing these stories to you, but it also shows that you value this kind of reflection. And if you're new here and want to keep diving into more stories that inspire, follow me and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to have you here for the next videos, where we'll always explore moments like this together. And hey, there's another story right here next to this one that's going to move you again. Click on it and come with me. I'll be waiting for you there for another journey of learning and reflection. See you soon.